data that I'm going to be sharing and feedback is from a survey that we actually ran a little while ago now. It was back in the end of April, when we were really interested in mapping out where teachers were on the road towards implementing the new curriculum. And it was very interesting because we received some quite apparently contradictory feedback, with teachers saying that they felt fairly well established in terms of where they were, and yet when we drilled down through some of the text-based responses, it was actually clear that there was still some way of finalising the detail of it. So I'm going to try and share some of the nuances of that research with you. So at that point, we were interested in finding out whether teachers had actually started to implement the new curriculum yet. And as you can see there, this is back in April. 54%, over half of the teachers, of whom 415 took part in this particular piece of research, had actually started to implement the new curriculum. Yes. So quite a large number had, and those who hadn't were planning on doing so from the beginning of this year. But there were some interesting comments there about the fact that although teachers have started to look at the process of implementation, they very much see it as a journey rather than September as being the end point and the destination. So, so that came through very clearly. I'm interested in knowing, in your consultations, I'm sure that you have schools with whom you are in frequent and regular contact. And I'm interested in knowing, in the discussions you've been having with some of your schools, about where they are in that process towards implementing the new curriculum. So if you're able just to share some feedback with us in the chat pod, in that open-ended poll, I will then share that with the rest of the group. And how are they feeling about it, possibly more importantly? So I'll just give everybody a minute there. And just while you're typing your comments in there, just a quick reminder for those of you who haven't sort of looked at it recently, what some of the differences are, the summary of changes between the old and the new curriculum. So we know that the new schemes of work are slimmed down. They far less prescriptive and unsupported by detailed planning units and training. And I think this is one of the key differences of this new curriculum implementation compared with that of previous ones, that schools have very much been left to do it, to come up with their own curriculum, which is based around the needs of their particular students. And whereas initially, when the draft schemes of work came out, there was a fear and concern from many teachers that they were very prescriptive. There now seems to be a switch, with teachers actually talking about the opportunities for greater creativity. There's certainly greater flexibility in the new curriculum, with learning objectives, approval to move learning objectives from year to year, providing they're covered by the end of the key stage that they're in. And in fact, in English, we've seen the Key Stage 2 programme of study being organised around paired year groups. And in fact, in our consultation, 77% of our teachers have said that they intend to move content around. It's a curriculum of fluency and mastery, particularly in maths, and children shouldn't progress until they've achieved complete fluency. And this concept of readiness for the next stage is becoming part of teachers' language and vocabulary. We know that the floor standard at the end of Key Stage 2 is described in terms of being secondary ready. And some of our primary school teachers are talking about their transition from Key Stage 1 to 2 in terms of our children Key Stage 2 ready. Teachers are also being encouraged to hold on to what's working in their current curriculum, and we know that from this research that a lot of our teachers have said that they are going to retain quite a large percentage of their current curriculum. So a third of the respondents to this particular survey have said that 3/4 or more of their current curriculum is going to be retained in the new curriculum. Of the subjects, and we did break it down, and maths is likely to see the highest level of change. We also know from this that 78% have said that they plan on organising their curriculum around topics. Now, this is a strategy that has been adopted by a lot of schools, and we did wonder with the new iteration of the curriculum whether it would see the move back towards a more discrete approach. But in fact, that's not the case. They talk about a curriculum, a creative curriculum, which is topic-based. And when we ask them about the topics they plan on retaining, again, quite a lot of the topics that they feel work are going to be kept, but they talk about moving away from some of the QCA topics of work. In English, again, teachers say that they're likely to continue teaching genre, even though this isn't specified in the new curriculum. And many plan to continue building literacy plans around text and text type, but perhaps rather than focusing on genre for genre's sake, thinking perhaps more about purpose and audience for writing. So, Jenny, maybe just a few words from you about what process your school has been going through, the school that you were working at before you joined School Zone, over the months leading up to the summer holidays, in thinking about how you were going to structure your new curriculum, and trying to decide what aspects of it were working well and would be retained, and what aspects you think you might actually, the school feels that more could be done.
Yeah, when I was working in the school, we were going through quite a long and quite a big journey. We were coming out of a notice to improve, and we were well on our way to good when some of the new curriculum was published, and so we were really thinking about the processes that we were using in our school and thinking about how we could tie them into the new curriculum. With the increased pressure on standards, the main subjects that we were looking at were English and maths, but again we wanted to really think about the wider curriculum as well and how we could introduce stimulating and exciting topics for the children, so that we were delivering the whole package really. We were really thinking about how we could introduce a very topic-led curriculum, very creative, but again dripping in links, particularly with the English, dripping in the links to make it exciting for the children as well. So those are the things that we were really concentrating on when we were thinking about modelling or remodelling our curriculum.
Brilliant, that's great. And let me just clear some of the screen a little bit over here and move on to the next slide. So yes, this is just a quote from one of the teachers saying, wanting to keep hold of what is really working well, but keen to introduce topics that the children are likely to enjoy, and using some of the foundation subjects as that starting point for generating new topics. This is an interesting one. We asked teachers how confident they felt about meeting the needs of children and Ofsted, and of course you might argue that the two are actually quite different things, and again I am going to hand over to Jenny here to talk about some of the tensions that teachers actually do feel, that they feel in some cases, and this is particularly coming into play with the new focus on progress and attainment targets, and I am going to be talking about that in a little while, but that sometimes teachers do feel slightly compromised by having to decide between whether they are meeting the needs of children or whether they're going to be putting in place something that Ofsted is going to approve. And Ofsted, at the moment, by many schools, is not seen as a supportive partner in the process of improving schools, but they are very much feared, and schools feel that they really do live or die by their Ofsted inspections. So it is seen as a culture, a climate of fear by many schools. Jenny, I know we are going to talk more about progress in a little while, but I thought possibly you could talk here about some of the feedback that we've been hearing from teachers about this need to show that children are making good levels of development, and how that's not just about the school's expectation of what those children are required, the progress those children are required to make, but also how that impacts on them personally through their performance management that's in place, and perhaps talk through some of those challenges that schools, or teachers rather, are facing.
Yes, definitely. Not only in my own experience, but just in the time that I've been with School Zone as well, talking to the teachers, it seems to be happening now in many schools where children's level of progress is now formulating part of teachers' performance management. So it's now playing a really, really big part in school life, particularly for the teachers, and how accountable they are for pupil progress. So how it seems to be taking shape is that teachers have a certain percentage of children that they have in their class who need to achieve a good level of development. That is, that those children need to they need to have made a certain number of points progress or a certain number of sub-levels progress over the academic year, and that is crucial really for teachers in order to show to the school and to the parents that those children are developing as the school feels that they should be. Now, particularly, the schools are focusing on the progress of maths and English, and those are really the two target subject areas, which isn't surprising. Those are the SAT subjects, so those are really what schools are focused in on. However, it wouldn't surprise me, just in my own experience, if that begins to trickle down into the foundation subjects as they are increasingly assessed more and more through more formative assessment. But I think that that might begin to play a bigger part as well.
That point again. I think, as Jenny was saying there, it may be, I think it's often the teachers who are at the start of early years foundation stage who feel, well, all teachers feel under pressure, but feel under particular pressure regarding the speed at which they start introducing formal learning structures in the classroom, where they've been set these fairly challenging targets of good levels of development. And they feel that the senior leadership team has really put them under scrutiny, and the expectation is that children will be working at a certain level by the end of that first year of school, regardless of whether they're actually ready or not. They feel that there is this tension between what they feel is in the children's best interest and the pressure they're under from the senior leadership team and their own performance management targets. And I think that that can be really challenging for them. And so we hear teachers talking about that. Those of you who are delivering training may be particularly interested in picking up some of these aspects to do with how to deliver good levels of development amongst children, and what that actually means in terms of how children are developing, and the efficacy, the evidence that you need to be able to provide to your senior leadership team. And some of that training may actually be about managing senior leadership team expectations, particularly in the climate that schools find themselves in now. So a quick slide here, which is about where schools are turning to for advice and support. And I'm conscious that there is a lot packed into that particular slide there. I don't know whether you can actually zoom into it a little bit more closely. And it is interesting to see where teachers are going for support and guidance in the absence of training provided by the government, through extra funding. We know that schools haven't received any extra money to support this, the new curriculum, and also the fact that many of the local authorities are no longer able to support schools. And I think what's particularly interesting, if I can draw your attention to the 6th source of training, which is in-house sharing of expertise and knowledge, and that is by far has the greatest level of take-up, not only in terms of the volume of schools who are actually turning to colleagues for sharing of expertise and good practice, but also the rating of that. So 36% of those in that category of 304 have said that the training that they've had from colleagues or peers within their school has been very useful, and 39% have described it as reasonably useful, and those not only is the level of uptake much higher with regards to internal training, but the levels of satisfaction are much higher. And we've certainly seen a switch in the CPD model. So whereas previously, when there was more money in the system, teachers were sent away on training more or less whether they wanted it or not, or schools were required to take up training whether they wanted it or not, there now seems to be a far greater sense that schools are auditing their own needs, looking at their school development plan to determine, and looking at Ofsted reports, obviously a big driver of school improvements, looking to see where they themselves have identified weaknesses and aspects that they could be doing better in. And then working, first of all, to make sure that they are making the most of their internal expertise. Many schools actually will also survey their own pupils to find out how pupils want to be taught, and some of them have actually re-evaluated their curriculum or re-evaluated their training needs, their school development plan in the light of pupils' own expectations. So that's a very interesting shift for us, and teachers are generally very positive about this greater drawing on expertise within the organisation. Possibly where this model of sharing expertise isn't working quite as well yet, although there's a lot of talk about it, is between cluster schools. And we know that there has been the rise in teaching schools, teaching alliances, and new consultants called SLEs, NLEs and LLEs, all of whom are tasked with the remit of working with other schools to raise standards. And less of that seems to be filtering through, certainly in our sample, although anecdotally we do hear more about that. And there too it's more of a partnership arrangement often, where a member of staff from the teaching school or an SLE will work on more of an ongoing basis, going into the school and working with them to achieve their targets and goals. So that's certainly a very interesting shift in the CPD model there. But some of the other sources of training and advice and expertise which have been put out by the government teachers seem largely oblivious of those. I don't know whether anybody's got any comments that they want to make about the training and development market, and any feedback they've had from teachers about the sort of training and advice that they're actually finding useful. So in fact, although there's been a lot of media coverage about the impact of the new curriculum and the fact that officially schools implemented from September 2014, although we know in fact it's been a far more gradual process and rollout than that, and in fact until the new SATs come into play, not all children will be being taught under the new curriculum. The really revolutionary change in schools is the assessment and accountability reform, and this is where teachers really are having to rethink their practice. And in fact, it's actually quite difficult for schools that these two elements have been discoupled. If you can imagine that any new curriculum should be going hand in hand with its new assessment regime, it is actually very difficult for schools to work towards the final version of the curriculum without yet knowing exactly how they're going to be assessing that new curriculum. So senior leaders in consultations with us have said that although they may be starting to teach the new curriculum, they realise that until they've seen details of how the new assessment and accountability regime are going to work, they can't actually finalise that. So that is holding schools in a sort of a bit of a limbo at the moment, making it very difficult for a lot of the commercial publishers and for yourselves to really start thinking about rolling out new resources to support the new curriculum. Resources, again, go hand in hand with assessment. And until schools are clearer about how they're going to be assessing learning, it is very difficult to be producing those resources. So a quick summary of the changes that are in the pipeline. So the new SATs tests, as I've already mentioned, are going to be taken in May 2016. They will no longer be using national curriculum level descriptors. So national curriculum levels have been used as a way of describing and measuring progress in schools for many, many years, and those are no longer part of the framework, the assessment framework. Instead, when the new SATs tests results are shared, they will be reported using a scaled score in which a score of 100 is the new expected standard. And that's, we've been told, is going to be the equivalent of level 4B. So national curriculum levels instead are going to be replaced with detailed performance descriptors for the end of key stage. We haven't yet seen these performance descriptors. We've been told that they are going to be available. Schools are going to have to come up with their own system for assessment, monitoring and tracking progress. And again, this is a big shift for schools to get their heads around. And certainly when we've spoken to senior leaders all the way down to ordinary, when I say ordinary teachers, classroom teachers, not that there's anything ordinary about being a teacher, right down to teachers, many, even those working at outstanding schools, are sitting back and waiting and hoping that somebody is going to come up with a solution. And this is partly cultural. This has certainly been a strategy in previous changes where schools have been given all the information they've needed, and I think they can't quite believe that this time they really are having to sort it out for themselves. I think also many of them previously have had their fingers burnt, so they've gone off, developed systems which have worked for their school, and then actually retrospectively one has come in and they've been told that they actually have to use an official system. So many of them are waiting to see, and indeed the advice is, the official guidance and advice at the moment is to continue using the national curriculum levels for assessment and monitoring purposes. And we've had mixed feedback, for example, on whether schools are going to carry on using a subsidiary system that was introduced under the last regime called Assessing Pupil Progress, APP. You may have heard of that. So some of them are adapting that, some of them are continuing to use it, some of them have discounted it altogether. Some local authorities are being more proactive than others and actually working with their schools to try and come up with an authority-based solution. Other schools are very much on their own. The other important, very important change is the introduction of 2 new floor standards. One of attainment, and the attainment measure has been set out as being aspirational. 85% of pupils are to be secondary ready in core subjects. You'll read above that this is linked in with the scaled score of 100, and the expectation that this is going to be set at about the existing level B. Now, currently, children are considered to be secondary ready, or the current attainment target is that children have to achieve level 4C. And not only that, but the target, I think, is at 65%. So not only is the quota being increased of 85% needing to achieve that across all core subjects, but the actual level that they need to get to is higher. So it's harder, more children have to get it. Teachers haven't yet seen the new tests, although there are sample tests available on the website, and there are real concerns about what this is going to mean for children, whether it's going to affect the amount of drilling that needs to take place. The other floor standard that we're going to see being introduced over the next 8 years or so it is a fairly slow process, is one based around a progress measure. So you may have seen again, and there's been quite a lot in the press about this, about the introduction of a baseline assessment, and I know certainly the unions are calling for teachers to boycott it. It's not actually compulsory, so schools may choose which of these floor standards they wish to report on. Both have to be declared on the school website, so they can't just draw a veil over attainment or over progress. They do have to report on those, but as long as they meet one or the other of those floor standards, they will not trigger an Ofsted inspection. And as I said there, they do need to publish both their progress and attainment data. So it is complex, and schools have struggled with this because what may seem apparently optional is actually possibly less so. So unless a school is supremely confident that they're going to meet their attainment target and 85% of their pupils are going to achieve this new higher level of level 4B, most schools are saying they are going to nonetheless take the baseline assessment as well, so they've got that as a kind of a fallback, even if their expectations of attainment are high. The other thing, of course, primary schools are trying to, are grappling with at the moment, is the fact that many primary schools have tiny cohorts. It's not unusual for a primary school to have only 10 children in each cohort. And you can imagine there how just a few very able children or a few who are struggling can massively swing that cohort attainment from very high performing to very low performing from one year to the next. Very difficult if a school is having to then explain to parents and to Ofsted why that has changed so radically from one year to the next. So that's an issue that they're having to try and tackle and explain to parents. Some schools also have high levels of mobility, so the children who start in reception may not be those who actually take the year 6. So schools so head teachers in schools with high levels of pupil mobility are talking about having different sets of data. So they track children who start and finish in the same school in one data set, but if there are questions over why some children are making apparently less progress than others, they have a separate set of data. So increasingly data is going to become a very important management tool for primary schools. Now we know that in secondary schools there's been a lot in the media about gaming and schools actually being playing the game to boost their league table performance and so on. And it'd be interesting to see whether this starts to happen in primary schools as well. So for example, with the baseline testing, there isn't one statutory baseline assessment or one test that all schools have to take. If they opt into that, they can choose, and publishers and test providers are being invited to put forward baseline assessments for approval. So they can choose a test. So it'll be interesting to see whether we see schools trying to choose tests which will deliver the lowest possible baseline scores so that they can maximise the progress score as far as possible. Any comments or thoughts about the impact of assessment? And I'm interested in knowing here whether you've heard anything back from any of your schools. And although assessment may seem a little bit remote if you're in the business of a charity producing resources, I think it is important. It's important to understand the culture of primary schools. It's important to understand that whereas previously primary schools may have selected a resource because of engagement, the children like it, the teacher likes it, they think it's going to be an enjoyable resource. We think we're going to see a shift in primary school teachers becoming far more rigorous in the way they're assessing which resources to use with their children and which not, and possibly scrutinising the skills that that resource is actually developing and looking at whether they can measure the development of those skills. Imagine a primary school teacher who has the Ofsted inspector coming into the classroom, and we know that this is happening at very short notice. Would they feel confident teaching an Ofsted, a lesson observed by Ofsted using one of your resources? Will they be able to show evidence of the children's learning over the course of that lesson? And these are things that we think charities are going to need to consider in the way they develop their resources. And there seems to be possibly a slight divergence in the way schools are reacting to some of this attainment and accountability. Schools that are outstanding and doing very well and feeling very confident are talking very much about the need to develop the whole child. Schools that are possibly feeling under pressure, maybe under notice to improve, are desperately trying to fight their way up and get to a position of good and outstanding. And there the focus becomes very, very limited to literacy and maths, English and maths. And again, Jenny, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, on opening up the curriculum versus narrowing it down, and the pressure the school is under to be able to show how results are going up in those core subjects of English and maths, and the impact that might have on the way you structure your curriculum, plan a unit of work, and focus on certain areas in the curriculum.
Yes, Melissa. I think you're absolutely right in that those schools that are under a lot more pressure from Ofsted, possibly because they're in a notice to improve or a similar situation, they have very, very different priorities to those schools that are good or outstanding, in that often for those schools to claw their way back, they need to improve their data, and as we all know, data is centred around maths and English, so consequently they become the focus of the curriculum, and that can actually have quite a negative impact on teaching and learning in the school. I speak from my own experience. In the first year that we went through after we were in notice to improve, the school really just drilled down on English and maths, and consequently the children and the teachers became quite disengaged because it was all that they were learning. So in the second year, we decided to adapt the way that we were teaching and make it more topic-based, to bring in more of those foundation subjects and make it more exciting for the children, but to incorporate English, particularly English, into our topic. And that was a very, very successful method of integrating your core English skills where your data is going to improve into an exciting and stimulating curriculum where the children are going to be engaged and they're going to progress. So it's a very, very fine balance. It's very difficult for schools to manage that balance because, as I say, those schools that are struggling more with Ofsted, they need to focus more on data and they need to make those leaps. So they need to really focus on closing the gap a lot more than those schools in good or outstanding situations. Maths seems to be approached slightly differently in schools, and again I've noticed that through my own personal experience and the experience of school zone research, in that maths does seem to be taught much more discreetly, and that seems to be the way that schools are moving forward with the new curriculum as well. So it's likely that we can really see maths being taught much more discreetly. There is, in the new curriculum, a much greater focus on number and on problem solving, and also in maths as a much higher expectation now. So the expectations, the standards in maths have really been raised. What was taught to children in year 2 is now being taught in year 1. What was taught in year 1 is now being taught in reception. That said, there are still opportunities for engaging maths in the more creative curriculum, and I think teachers do take those opportunities where they are presented. But certainly, in terms of schools making that progress, in terms of schools who are looking to improve the category that they're in with Ofsted, I think their primary focus is their data, and that, as I say, that comes with maths and English levels.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Jenny. So just a quick run through then. And again, we'll be reiterating some of the points already made about the impact of some of these changes on teachers and also those who are in the commercial sector and charities as well. So the fact that there are no curriculum levels are being abolished. We don't yet know what the new performance descriptors are going to look like. Teachers don't know exactly how they're going to be assessing the progress or the expectations over progress at the end of each year, but they know that it is going to be different. And this is causing some content developers to step back and wait and see how that space develops. So we're in a slight chicken and egg situation at the moment with the development of new resources to sit alongside the new curriculum. Teachers want them, they're looking for new resources, but some of the resource developers are backing off because until the assessment regime is clearer, it's not entirely clear how some of those resources should be developed. In the interim, schools are being advised to use year-based content as a marker of whether children have acquired that learning. So you'll recall I talked about this curriculum as being one of fluency and mastery. So teachers are being advised to look at the actual description of the content that children should have developed by the end of that year, so that they can use that as a means of assessing learning. We're hopefully going to see the new end of key stage descriptors before the end of the year, and schools may want to extrapolate those down. So at the moment they're just going to be for the end of phase. Schools will probably want to come up with their own end of year descriptors. In spite of schools saying that they realise that aspects of assessment could be better, they are reluctant to change what they know works. So there's this slightly mixed message coming through that although they admit that the national curriculum levels, for example, can be quite confusing, the children are familiar with them, they are familiar with them, parents are familiar with them. So there's that comfort factor of what they know. It may not be perfect, but it works, versus the great unknown at the moment. So I think that's causing a lot of schools to stall. Talked about the optional baseline. And we did a quick poll, again in this survey, so bear in mind that this teachers were being polled very soon after the announcements had been made, about whether teachers would be likely to introduce the new baseline tests. And you can see that there are high levels of uncertainty, but certainly in consultations we've had subsequently, it does seem as though most schools are likely to do it. So although, as I said, teaching unions are advising schools that it's not good practice to be testing children so very early on, in fact many schools are very in favour of progress because they feel that that is at the heart of what a good school should be doing. So in a way it levels the playing field, because regardless of how impoverished or how few skills children may be starting school with, it takes a snapshot of where they are when they start and then enables the school to really build on that. So schools that are working in disadvantaged and deprived areas where children are starting with very low levels won't be measured against those schools in affluent, wealthy areas where children are coming in with high levels of verbal communication and already maybe being able to write and read a little bit as well. So schools do feel in many ways it is fairer, although again that is countered again with the fact that it is being linked with performance management. So teachers do see it sometimes as giving with one hand, and as government giving with one hand and taking with the other. We talked about tougher assessments, genuine concerns about what this means for low retaining children, those who struggle, those who just some are born and start school with a slight disadvantage. Is it realistic to expect, as Jenny was saying, to expect children to be working at that level earlier than they were previously? And the fear that there's going to be a shift away from enjoyment of the curriculum, enjoyment of learning, towards performance. We talked about a lot of these. The fact that it is going to be a major change, but also the concern that at the moment the schools have got nothing to measure progress against because there isn't any standardisation. So that's going to be a challenge for them as well. So one of the things schools are grappling with is that they really need to be able to be tracking children all the way through their schools, all the way through their year groups and phases, to highlight very early if children are lagging behind, so they can put in place an intervention. So this is something that they are going to need to look at. They are doing already, but will need to do more of, and make sure the progress is even. And again, a tricky one for teachers, because teachers know that children don't progress evenly in their development. So they'll go through spurts as they go through in their own physical growth. They'll have spurts where they do suddenly develop and then plateau, and yet they are at the same time saying that they need to make sure that progress is even through the year groups, so you don't get a very, very competent teacher actually masking a lack of progress in the next year. So they are aware that every teacher is going to have to be accountable. So challenges there for them as well. I'm not going to talk too much more about this because I'm conscious that this becomes quite technical and possibly is more than is going to be relevant. And just from Ofsted, the guidance from Ofsted about their expectations, that they are going to have to see, although there won't be a common assessment system across all schools, schools will need to be able to show that the assessment system actually does work effectively and is easily understandable to staff, pupils. The other change, of course, that we're seeing in classrooms is the impact of new technology, and we know that the interactive whiteboard revolutionised primary school teaching particularly, although also important for secondary schools, in the early sort of 2000s, very much supported by ELC funding, which is ring-fence funding for schools. We are seeing a similar sort of revolution taking place with tablets in class, but obviously there isn't any ring-fence funding to support it. So what we're tending to see more is that when primary schools are replacing their existing infrastructure, rather than replacing them with tablets or with PCs, they are tending to replace them more with tablets or iPads. And it seems to be 50-50 based, although many primary schools, although this data doesn't seem to reflect that, anecdotally we tend to hear teachers talking more about iPads. And if any of you are interested, we run something called the Schools and Buyers Guide, where we get teachers to rate what they're using in terms of various product types. We did one on tablets about a year ago. I'm happy to share that with you. But we're certainly seeing a massive growth in the use of tablets. 56% of primary school teachers using them in class. That statistic probably sounds more exciting than it really is. The reality is that in many primary schools there's still a shared set of tablets or iPads which the classroom teacher has to book. And what tends to happen is that you'll get one or two teachers in the school who feel very confident about using them. They may have been the ones who pushed the initiative ahead, they may have gone on training, or they may just have a personal interest in it. And we often find other teachers saying, well, I never get a chance to look at it because the Year 6 teacher books up the class set all the time, or I don't feel very confident about it, so I tend not to book them that often. So although that's an average, within schools the take-up tends to be very variable. So you get really enthusiastic, confident teachers using them a lot, and other teachers for whom they possibly never actually used a tablet or iPad in the classroom. But it is obviously the way ahead. It makes perfect sense for primary schools, much quicker. All the difficulties with logging on no longer exist with tablets. Immediate access to the internet, providing a Wi-Fi connection is robust enough, and all sorts of new technologies that allow teachers to actually be able to see what the children are looking at and share information that they're viewing on their screens with what's happening on the interactive whiteboard. So the trend is only going to continue. 22% of all computers are tablets, rising to 36%. But interestingly, we've not seen a great deal of evidence so far that this is really impacting on the structure of lessons. So typically in lessons, and I know many of you who are producing free resources work very much on this, the lesson will start with an interactive whiteboard session, and that's obviously often the wow element in the lesson, where the teacher will try to get all the children's attention engaged by that exciting little lesson starter, which may be a song, it may be a video clip, short, sharp, not long enough for the children to turn off and become passive, but really get them talking. And then the children will be set group activities, maybe some independent activities, and then the plenary session at the end may again involve using the interactive whiteboard to summarise the learning. And I'm conscious that that is a huge generalisation. But teaching in primary classrooms, in spite of encouragement from Ofsted to move more towards independent child-based learning, still tends to be very teacher-driven and teacher-led. And that's still the legacy of the interactive whiteboard very much, where the teacher is the expert, the teacher holds the technology and controls the technology. Where we are getting tablets being used, they're often used for research purposes. They're being used very much as a movable set of laptops would have been used in the past, where children log on, maybe play some computer games, do some research, maybe write something on the computer. So we're not seeing a huge amount of evidence of tablets yet really changing the teaching paradigm and the way that the interactive whiteboard did when that first came into play. But again, I am very interested in hearing whether anybody in today's group has seen any evidence that that tablets are changing play in primary school classrooms. I know again we get a lot of interest from charities who are wanting to produce resources that can be viewed on tablets. And again, when we ask this question in research, teachers do think to struggle to think about what a charity could usefully provide that could be used on a tablet or an iPad. But again, if anybody has anything else to add to that. Pupil premium. So again, pupil premium is a new tranche of funding that has been hugely beneficial, particularly for primary schools, more so than secondary schools, and has actually weighted now towards primary schools. So from September, the funding first came into effect, I think 3 years ago, and every year has gone up fairly substantially. This year, every primary school pupils who are eligible to have pupil premium funding attached to them carry an extra £1,300 of funding each. So a lot of money for many small primary schools, particularly those obviously working in areas of social deprivation. So one of the measures for primary pupil premium funding being eligibility for free school meals, and not just current eligibility but also historic eligibility as well. So we are seeing generally, but I'm conscious that this research is going back now to the previous year where primary schools level of pupil premium funding was perhaps not as big as it is from this year, but it is going to be particularly interesting to see whether schools do start to ring-fence the funding. Notionally, they are supposed to ring-fence the funding for focusing on children who are from socially deprived homes. The thinking being that those are the children who are at greatest risk of not succeeding well at school or of lagging behind their wealthier peers. As we know from research, that relationship is not quite as clear-cut as the policymakers would have us think. It is more closely linked to ethnic groupings. So, for example, we know that white working-class boys who are on pupil premium funding are amongst the poorest performing in terms of school results, whereas Asian girls tend to do extremely well regardless of their family wealth or affluence. So it's a fairly crude measure, but certainly one that has been very lucrative for many schools. So we're generally finding that where there's more money, schools are more likely to set it aside for specific initiatives. They are supposed to be able to demonstrate to Ofsted how the money is being targeted at children who come from socially deprived homes, and also be able to demonstrate the impact that funding has had on improving those children's outcomes. So schools tend to have quite a mixed response to this. They will use pupil premium funding to invest in school trips, things that they say broaden children's horizons. Very difficult to measure the impact of that on school results. Again, this goes back really to the confidence of the school very often. So schools who are feeling very confident about their school strategy are more likely to feel that they can use the funding perhaps in a slightly more relaxed way. Those that are working very hard to improve their Ofsted rating probably feel that the money needs to be spent more directly on interventions, one-to-one interventions, so assessing and picking up where children are at risk of lagging behind and then pulling them out of class and perhaps focusing on one-to-one coaching, small group interventions and extra resources for those. And obviously that is an area that's going to be of real interest. Again, research tends to suggest that SENCOs do seem to be having quite a lot of say over how that pupil premium funding is being spent. And again, it would be interesting to hear from those of you who are in the SEN market, working with schools on that, whether that's your experience as well. So are you seeing SENCOs having some say or total say over how pupil premium funding is being spent, and ensuring that it is actually going to the children of greatest need, developmental need, perhaps rather than social need. So again, it would be interesting to hear back from those of you who do have some experience in this about where schools are tending to prioritise the funding. Yes, those of you who are not sure, so I'm actually drawing here on industry stats. Schools Zone's a member of an organisation called Visa, which carries out research. And I was looking at a research report that they put out fairly recently, where they're claiming that 55% of participants in this particular piece of research suggested that pupil premium funding is ring-fenced. and they're claiming that the areas that it is being ring-fenced for, 43% are saying it's being ring-fenced for CPD and training, 26 say it's been spent on, and obviously not all of these are mutually exclusive, which is why the total adds up to more than 100%. 26% of schools are spending it on class size reductions, 86% are spending it on one-to-one interventions, and 40% are spending it on classroom resources. And this is one of the things that does make it very hard for schools to actually track and attribute the impact of any of these, because typically a child will be benefiting from more than one of these areas of spend at any one time. So it's very difficult for schools to say that that particular improvement in that child's schools is attributable to staff training that that teacher went on, as opposed to a particular resource. And this is one of the things that does make it extremely difficult for schools. But if you have any feedback from schools that you're working with on how the money's being spent, it would be really useful to know that. Brilliant. And I think that probably more or less brings me to the end of the evaluation of the things that have come up in the research we're looking at. I think it's useful. Let me just get rid of so. I'd like to end off just by evaluating some of the opportunities for charities and what this means. And it's interesting, the same questions come up again and again when we are talking to charities about the various aspects we've been talking about today. Is there an opportunity? We feel that there is, and certainly a lot of charities feel that there is too. Many charities are using the new curriculum as an opportunity to reevaluate what they're putting out there for schools and think again about how they might restructure some of their offerings. Unlike previous curricular changes where there was a real rush to get everything out at the point at which schools would be implementing the new curriculum, that same urgency doesn't seem to be applying. The process is really just starting to take place now. And I think that's no bad thing, because it allows you to monitor and see how the new curriculum is taking place in schools. Don't forget that schools are now required to publish details of their curriculum on their website, so information about how schools are structuring learning is ever easier to find. So you can actually go onto schools' websites and see how they are responding to the new curriculum and see how they are also responding and evaluating children's progress as well. But I think my earlier message about expectations around charities' resources is a really important one to bear in mind. Charities tend, certainly those that we work with, tend to focus a lot of their resources in the PSHE area. And although I don't want to say that that isn't important, it is worth considering, of course, that many primary schools are going to be putting a lot of scrutiny on what's happening in English and maths and the foundation subjects, and possibly prioritising those above a subject like PSHE citizenship. So it may be worth looking at those cross-curricular links and tapping into some of the topics and themes that teachers say that they are still going to be looking at. And in that survey that I shared the results from you earlier, we did ask teachers to say which topics and themes they are going to be using. Very happy to share that report with you, so if you'd like to receive a copy of that full report completely free of charge, please say so in the chat pod. Amy, thanks for joining us. Great to have you on board. As I said, do put that, I'm very happy to share that report with you, and that does give a more detailed breakdown of the topics the teachers are going to be retaining, as well as the new ones that they are going to be implementing as well. So primary school teachers' expectations are likely to become higher, and they will need to be confident that the resource is not just going to be an enjoyable one, although enjoyment is not to be dismissed, that it is also going to be one that allows them to develop the skills that they need to develop within that particular unit of work. Although I did say that we've not yet seen a huge impact of new technology on the way teachers are using resources, it is something worth bearing in mind. and certainly thinking about if you're developing something that you would hope children could use on a tablet, particularly an iPad, that that just very straightforward things like Flash isn't going to work. So it's something that many of our publishers have had to do, is go back and reconfigure some of their digital resources so that they do run on iPads. We've talked about social media and teacher networking sites. Teachers are great networkers. They also like to adapt, amend, and rework. So if you are putting resources out there, I know it feels that I'm stating the obvious, don't put them out there in PDF version, or if you do, put them out in Word version as well. Even if 20 teachers have said that that's the perfect resource, there will be as many, if not more, who want to adapt it, tweak it, think about differentiating it slightly, and they like to be able to do that and make it their own. So make sure that resources that you're putting out there for teachers to use are editable and can be changed and adapted for the needs of their particular pupils. Generally, quite a lot of charities ask us about the flexibility of resources in terms of age ranges. And obviously resources like videos can be used across a very wide age range. But in terms of, if you're thinking about producing things like activity sheets that might sit alongside a short video or little PowerPoint presentation, generally one key stage is probably about as far as that particular set of resources will stretch if it's editable and adaptable for teachers. Beyond that, and you start to run into concerns about age appropriateness. So teachers will adapt and amend and take something that's intended for children a little bit older and amend it for younger ones, but that's probably about as far as you can stretch something that is that's intended as an activity sheet, not worksheet. Note the very careful choice of vocabulary there. Maximise your exposure. Make sure that stuff that is interesting is on TES, is on YouTube. Teachers will go to those sites long before they go to charity sites. Teachers often are very vague about their understanding of what sorts of charities are producing resources, and if so, what sorts of resources they are producing. So they're more likely to stumble across your resources on one of those sites than they are by going onto your own website. So that's something that is worth bearing in mind as well. If there is anything else you want to put into the chat pod for me to answer or for us to discuss, please do put that into the chat pod, and I'll do my very best. Jenny, I don't know if you've got any final comments to make. I think one thing I do just want to say is that when we speak to publishers and when we speak to charities, there is this perception and frustration that they put all this great stuff out there, whether it's stuff that teachers have to pay for or stuff that's available for them for free, and they promote it and they send emails and flyers and tell teachers about it, and teachers just still don't know that it's there. And if you've had that experience, don't lose heart, carry on telling teachers that it's there. Teachers spend a tiny, tiny percentage of their time actually looking for resources, and much of that time might be late at night on a Sunday evening when they desperately need something for the next morning. Increasingly, teachers' time is spent on all the peripheral aspects, which link in with many of the performance and attainment targets that we were talking about earlier, and the amount of time that they actually have to look for new resources is a fraction of probably what they would like, and certainly what the industry feels that they ought to be doing. So it is very frustrating. You may have the most fantastic resource there for a teacher to use, completely free of charge, and it can be very disheartening that they're not going there. But bear in mind that looking for resources really does take up a very, very small percentage. Teachers exist in a little bubble, and I'll hand over to Jenny here, because it's probably more powerful if it comes from her than from me, but this is something that we hear again and again, the difficulty that teachers have in finding time to look for resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was really just going to finish off sort of, and I'll just be echoing really what Melissa has said, in that I really, from a teacher's perspective, I really believe that there is a big market for charity resources. I think teachers, as I sort of said earlier, teachers are sort of now moving out of that phase of just teaching maths and English. They want to make learning fun. They want to incorporate the foundation subjects more. And I think we're sort of entering a bit of a new age. And
everybody. And I think that is probably it from me. But if there's anything else, as I said, you want to ask me, please do put it in the chat pod now. And I'll do my very best to answer it. Or if you'd rather discuss it with me privately, if you just want to, you can either privately text me your question, or you can just ask me to give you a call if you just want to put that into the chat pod. And perhaps give me a telephone number as well. I'd be very happy to do that. School Zone's very happy to go in and talk to organisations. If you're thinking about the possibility of doing some research and want to discuss what it is you want to find out, my colleague Philip and I, along with Jenny and other members of the research team, are very happy to go in and give you several hours of just sort of general chat and consultation about where your organisation might be going, and the ways of perhaps finding out what you need to know, talking to you about your research objectives, and we're also trying to work with organisations so that they can understand their own data better. So we may be able to have a look at some of your own data that you've gathered and see what that tells you. So do feel free to keep in touch with us. Brilliant. And interestingly, most of us are still wired into email. I am too. Philip does if you're not part of Philip's research community on LinkedIn, please let me know and I will ask Philip to, I'm not quite sure how it works on LinkedIn, but extend the invitation to you so you can join the research community. And I know he does put out quite a lot of extra information through his LinkedIn research community as well. He tends to be more active on LinkedIn than I am. Brilliant.